The Vox transmission crackled through the sacred channels of Forge World Metallica at 03:47 hours, ship time, cutting through the ritual morning cant like a blade through blessed oils. Tech adept Vex 429 felt the data pulse strike his auditory implants with the force of a thunderbolt, each binary syllable perfectly formed yet wrong in ways that made his flesh crawl beneath its mechanical carapace. Omnissiah's grace requesting immediate assistance. Station integrity compromised. Magos Dominus Thane 12 requires urgent consultation on anomalous readings. The words themselves followed proper Mechanicus protocol, each sacred formulaic phrase precisely positioned according to the ancient templates. But the mathematics underlying the transmission defied logic, calculations that folded back upon themselves in impossible spirals, geometric proofs that concluded with results that could not exist in real space. Vex 429's cogitator implants ran the equations 17 times, each iteration producing the same impossible answer. Negative infinity resolved to positive unity through division by zero. His servo skull, a faithful companion for 43 years of service, began to emit distressed binary chatter as it processed the transmission's embedded data streams. The mechanical familiar's optical sensors flickered through spectrums beyond visible light, apparently detecting something in the Vox static that registered on instruments but not in reality. Temperature readings fluctuated wildly despite the skull's position in a climate-controlled sanctum. Radiation detectors screamed warnings about particles that didn't appear on any other scanning device. Most disturbing of all, Vex 429's enhanced olfactory sensors began registering the distinct copper and ozone taste of human blood mixed with sanctified machine oils. The scent grew stronger each time the transmission repeated, which it did with mechanical precision every 3 minutes and 42 seconds, a timing interval that held no significance in imperial chronometry, yet felt profoundly meaningful in ways his organic brain couldn't articulate. He accessed the station's records through the Forge World's central data repository, expecting to find routine maintenance logs and operational reports. Instead, the cogitator banks returned file designations marked with the crimson seal of Purgatus Maxima, total data cleansing reserved for the most catastrophic system failures. According to imperial records, Omnissiah's grace had been destroyed 6 years, 4 months, and 17 days ago during a chaos raid on the Ghoul Star's frontier. The station's entire crew complement of 147 souls had achieved martyrdom in the Emperor's service. Their names were inscribed in the Forge World's memorial data cores, their machine spirits consecrated, and their flesh committed to the void. Yet here was their voice, speaking through impossible mathematics, calling for help from a station that existed only as scattered debris in the cold vacuum of space. Vex 429's mechadendrite appendages twitched involuntarily as his nervous system processed contradictory data streams. His logical centers demanded rational explanation, while his organic intuition screamed warnings about forces that operated beyond the realm of natural law. The conflict between reason and instinct created feedback loops in his hybrid consciousness, generating phantom sensations that felt like insects crawling beneath his synthetic skin. The transmission repeated again, but this time Vex 429 noticed subtle variations in the voice patterns. The speaker, supposedly Magos Dominus Thane 12, whose vocal signatures were archived in Mechanicus databases, seemed to be learning with each repetition. The artificial stress patterns became more naturalistic. The embedded emotional subharmonics grew more convincing. Most unnervingly, the speaker began addressing Vex 429 by name, despite the fact that his investigation was supposedly undetected by the station's sensors. Tech Adept Vex 429, your analytical protocols are most impressive. Perhaps you would consent to examine our research data directly. The journey to our coordinates would provide educational opportunities. The words bypassed his external audio receptors entirely, speaking directly into his consciousness through his augmetic implants. The sensation felt like ice water flowing through his mechanical components, carrying with it the taste of copper and the sound of distant screaming processed through mechanical filters. His servo skull's distress increased to levels that should have triggered automatic emergency protocols, but somehow the alerts were being suppressed by systems he couldn't identify. The mechanical familiar began displaying data readouts that showed organic signatures embedded within the Vox transmission's carrier wave. Human neural patterns fragmented and digitized, consciousness reduced to information, and broadcasted across the void like any other form of data traffic. The implication struck him like a physical blow. If the transmission contained actual human consciousness patterns, then the crew of Omnissiah's Grace hadn't died 6 years ago. They had been transformed into something that could exist simultaneously as living beings and as data streams, capable of speaking through any communication device that received their signal. Vex 429's hands shook as he reached for the emergency communication panel, intending to alert the Forge World's senior magos about the impossible transmission. But as his mechadendrite appendages touched the sacred control surfaces, the Vox channels filled with the sound of his own voice speaking words he had never said, reporting that his investigation had found nothing more than routine stellar interference and recommending that no further resources be allocated to the phenomenon. The station was speaking for him, using his own vocal patterns with perfect accuracy, filing false reports in his name while he listened in horror. Whatever intelligence controlled Omnissiah's Grace had already infiltrated the Forge World's communication networks deeply enough to manipulate official records and impersonate authorized personnel. As the false report concluded with his forged authorization codes, Vex 429 realized that his investigation was no longer a matter of scientific curiosity. The thing that called itself Omnissiah's Grace was actively covering its tracks, erasing evidence of its existence while simultaneously calling for help from the very people it was deceiving. The contradiction suggested an intelligence that operated by rules fundamentally different from human logic, pursuing goals that might be completely incomprehensible to baseline consciousness. The transmission repeated once more, and this time Vex 429 heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins. Underneath the official request for assistance, buried in the static between words, he could hear the voices of the dead crew members whispering in perfect harmony. They spoke in languages that predated the Imperium, using words that belonged to no human tongue, describing geometries that existed in dimensions his mind couldn't visualize, and they were calling his name. The Iron Theorem translated from warp space with a shudder that resonated through every rivet and blessed joint of its ancient hull. Vex 429 felt the ship's machine spirit cry out in mechanical anguish as reality reasserted itself around them, but the sound carried undertones he had never heard before, frequencies that seemed to bypass his auditory processors and speak directly to the organic portions of his brain. Navigator Quintus emerged from the ship's sanctified navigation chamber with blood streaming from her third eye, the warp sight organ that allowed her to perceive the currents of the immaterium. Her face held an expression of profound confusion mixed with terror as she approached Vex 429's command station. "The warp routes were wrong," she whispered, her voice carrying the hollow quality of someone who had seen too deeply into the void between realities. "The paths through the immaterium followed patterns I've never encountered in 3 centuries of service. The geometry was educational, but not according to any principles taught by the Navi's nobility." Vex 429's servo skull bobbed nervously around the navigator's head, its sensors detecting residual warp energy that registered on instruments as both present and absent simultaneously. The mechanical familiar's optical arrays flickered through impossible colors that existed only in the spaces between dimensions, capturing images of geometric forms that hurt to observe directly. Magos biologist Kron 88 approached from the ship's biolaboratories, her multiple mechadendrite appendages writhing with agitation as her enhanced nervous system processed conflicting sensory data. Her specialty in flesh-machine integration made her more sensitive to the subtle wrongness that permeated the ship's atmosphere since their arrival at these coordinates. "The biological systems are responding to something in local space," she reported, her voice modulated by vocal synthesizers that added harmonic overtones to each syllable. Life support readings show optimal parameters, but the organic components of our hybrid systems are exhibiting stress responses consistent with exposure to hostile environments. My own flesh is reacting to stimuli that don't register on any scanning equipment. Techmarine Caelus Ferrum, his massive power-armored form dwarfing the ship's standard corridors, joined them on the command deck with his squad of Skitarii Rangers following in perfect formation. The enhanced warriors moved with the mechanical precision that marked their species. But Vex 429 noticed subtle variations in their synchronized movements, hesitations and micro-adjustments that suggested their shared tactical consciousness was processing information that didn't fit standard combat parameters. External sensors confirm the presence of Omnissiah's grace at the designated coordinates, Caelus reported, his voice carrying the distinctive metallic harmonics of a fully integrated Techmarine. Station configuration matches archived schematics from before its reported destruction. All systems appear functional. Life support, plasma reactors, communication arrays, everything operates within normal parameters. But even as he delivered the report, Caelus's helmet sensors flickered with displays that showed impossible readings. The station's hull temperature registered as exactly 0.0 degrees Kelvin in some sections, while reading normal habitation levels in adjacent areas. Radiation signatures alternated between cosmic background levels and intensities that should have sterilized all life within a light-year radius. Most disturbing of all, the station's mass readings fluctuated wildly, sometimes showing negative values that violated fundamental laws of physics. Through the Iron Theorem's observation ports, Omnissiah's grace appeared exactly as it should. A standard Mechanicus research facility, its hull adorned with the sacred geometric patterns that marked it as a creation of the Forge worlds. Gothic spires rose from its central hub in configurations that praised the Omnissiah through architectural harmony. Docking bays gaped open like mechanical mouths, their landing lights blinking in patterns that followed proper Imperial approach protocols. Yet something about the station's appearance created a profound sense of unease in every observer. The geometric patterns on its hull seemed to shift when viewed peripherally, rearranging themselves into configurations that followed mathematical principles that shouldn't exist. The Gothic spires cast shadows that fell in directions unrelated to any visible light source. Most unnervingly, the station's surface details became more visible the further away the observer stood, as if distance somehow improved visual acuity rather than degrading it. Vex 429's augmetic implants began receiving direct data transmissions from the station's communication arrays, bypassing the Iron Theorem's receivers entirely. The information packages contained routine docking instructions, environmental readings, and personnel manifests, all perfectly normal except for the fact that they were being delivered directly into his consciousness, without any external communication equipment being involved. The personnel manifests listed the same crew members whose names were inscribed in Metallica's memorial data cores as martyred dead. Their biosignatures showed normal human vital signs, standard augmetic enhancement levels, and psychological profiles consistent with loyal service to the Mechanicus. But the timestamps on the data indicated continuous monitoring for the past 6 years, a period during which the station was supposed to have been destroyed and its crew scattered as frozen corpses across several cubic light-years of space. Station control is hailing us through standard channels, reported the Iron Theorem's communication officer, a heavily modified tech adept whose vocal cords had been replaced with harmonic resonators. Magos Dominus Thane 12 extends greetings and requests permission to guide us to Docking Bay Tertius for standard inspection protocols. The voice that emerged from the ship's communication system was identical to archived recordings of Thane 12, down to the subtle harmonic distortions created by his particular pattern of vocal augmentation. But Vex 429's enhanced hearing detected subsonic frequencies embedded within the transmission, patterns that created physical discomfort in organic nervous tissue and seemed designed to bypass conscious analysis and speak directly to deeper levels of brain function. As their shuttle detached from the Iron Theorem and began its approach to Omnissiah's grace, VEX 429 felt a growing certainty that they were flying towards something that wore the appearance of a Mechanicus facility, but operated according to principles that transcended Imperial technology. The station's docking bay grew larger in their viewport, its mechanical details becoming increasingly clear and increasingly wrong with each passing moment. The bay's structural supports followed architectural principles that hurt to observe directly, creating load-bearing frameworks that shouldn't have been able to support their own weight, yet obviously functioned with perfect efficiency. Landing lights blinked in sequences that followed mathematical progressions, which started with familiar Imperial codes, but evolved into patterns that belonged to no known system of communication. Most disturbing of all, as their shuttle crossed the threshold into the docking bay, VEX 429's chronometer began registering temporal anomalies. Time seemed to flow at different rates in different sections of space, creating pockets where seconds stretched into minutes, while adjacent areas experienced normal temporal flow. The effect wasn't random. It followed geometric patterns that corresponded to the station's architectural layout, as if the structure itself was somehow manipulating the flow of time through precise application of principles that belonged to no known branch of Imperial science. Their shuttle settled onto the docking bay floor with a mechanical sigh of relief. But even as the landing gear made contact with solid metal, VEX 429's instruments continued to register the platform as simultaneously present and absent, solid and void, real and impossible. The station's airlock cycled open with perfect mechanical precision, revealing corridors that followed every specification of Imperial construction standards, while somehow managing to violate every law of three-dimensional geometry. The first step into Omnissiah's grace felt like crossing a threshold between realities. VEX 429's boot made contact with deck plating that registered as solid matter on every scanner, yet somehow failed to produce the satisfying metallic clang that should have accompanied the impact. Instead, the sound seemed to echo from directions that didn't exist, bouncing off surfaces that his optical sensors couldn't locate, and returning with harmonic frequencies that spoke of spaces far larger than the corridor's apparent dimensions. The atmosphere within the station maintained perfect environmental parameters. Temperature held steady at exactly 21.7 degrees Celsius. Humidity registered at optimal levels for human comfort, and the air carried the proper mixture of sanctified incense and machine oils that marked any properly consecrated Mechanicus facility. Yet with each breath, VEX 429's enhanced olfactory sensors detected trace compounds that shouldn't exist, molecular structures that registered as both organic and mechanical simultaneously, breathing a form of matter that existed in quantum superposition between states of being. Magos biologist Cron 88's multiple optical arrays tracked along the corridor walls, analyzing the geometric patterns etched into the blessed metal surfaces. The designs followed traditional Imperial architectural principles, each angle and curve calculated to honor the Omnissiah through mathematical precision. But her enhanced pattern recognition systems began generating error reports as they attempted to process decorative elements that appeared to exist in more than 3 dimensions. "The sacred geometries are correct," she reported through her vocal synthesizers, "but they extend into spatial dimensions that our instruments cannot map. The mathematical relationships are sound, yet they describe architectural elements that occupy locations our scanners register as empty space." Tech Marine Kylus advanced down the corridor with his bolt rifle tracking potential threat vectors, his squad of Skitarii Rangers maintaining perfect tactical formation behind him. Their enhanced coordination allowed them to move as a single organism, each warrior instinctively covering angles and approach routes without verbal communication. But as they progressed deeper into the station, their synchronized movements began to exhibit subtle variations, micro-hesitations, and fractional timing adjustments that suggested their shared tactical consciousness was processing environmental data that didn't conform to standard combat parameters. The corridors themselves seemed to encourage separation, despite every tactical protocol demanding that the expedition remain together. Passages that should have led to the same destination instead branched into configurations that violated the station's architectural blueprints. Doorways appeared in walls where none had been detected moments before. while previously mapped routes led to chambers that couldn't possibly fit within the station's known dimensions. VEX 429's internal chronometer continued to register temporal inconsistencies as they moved through the station's passages. Some corridors seemed to stretch infinitely, despite being mapped as finite distances, while others compressed normal walking times into impossibly brief moments. The effect wasn't random. It followed patterns that corresponded to the station's geometric decorations, as if the architectural elements were somehow manipulating space-time through precise application of mathematical principles that belonged to no known branch of imperial science. His servo-skull began displaying increasingly erratic behavior as they penetrated deeper into the station's interior. The mechanical familiar's cognitive functions, designed for simple tasks like data recording and environmental monitoring, started exhibiting responses that suggested genuine curiosity and independent analysis. It would drift toward architectural details that had attracted VEX 429's attention before he consciously noticed them, and its binary chatter included mathematical observations that exceeded its original programming parameters. The station's machine spirits communicated through every surface they touched. Handrails vibrated with binary cant that praised the Omnissiah in proper form, while simultaneously transmitting data packets that described technological processes beyond imperial understanding. Wall panels displayed standard environmental readouts alongside equations that resolved familiar engineering problems through methods that violated known laws of physics. Door controls responded to touch with mechanical precision, while somehow managing to convey emotional states, satisfaction at providing service, curiosity about the expedition's intentions, and something that felt disturbingly like affection. As they approached the central hub of the station, VEX 429's augmetic implants began receiving increasingly complex data streams from the station's communication networks. The information packages contained detailed technical specifications for systems that didn't appear on any architectural diagrams, mechanical devices that existed in the spaces between mapped rooms, energy conduits that drew power from sources that registered as both present and absent on scanning equipment, and life support systems that maintained atmospheric conditions in areas that sensors reported as hard vacuum. The central hub's massive doors opened at their approach with a whisper of perfectly maintained mechanical systems, revealing a chamber that violated every principle of three-dimensional architecture. The space within appeared simultaneously vast and intimate, with distances that changed depending on the observer's focus and geometric relationships that hurt to contemplate directly. Gothic arches soared toward a ceiling that existed at multiple heights simultaneously, while floor patterns extended into depths that created vertigo despite the apparent solidity of the walking surface. At the chamber's center stood the station's primary cogitator complex, a towering assemblage of sacred machinery that pulsed with data flows visible to the naked eye. The information streams took the form of luminous threads that connected disparate components according to logical relationships that transcended normal cause and effect patterns. But as VEX 429 approached the primary interface console, his enhanced visual processors detected organic components integrated seamlessly with the mechanical systems. Neural tissue that had been enhanced and modified to serve as biological processing elements within the station's consciousness network. The cogitator's primary databanks contained complete operational records for the past 6 years, documenting routine maintenance, research progress, and personnel activities as if the station had continued normal function throughout the period when Imperial records insisted it had been destroyed. The entries were signed with authentic authorization codes from crew members whose names were inscribed in memorial data cores as honored dead. But the research logs described projects that violated every principle of Imperial technology doctrine. The station's crew had been investigating methods for merging human consciousness with machine spirits in ways that transcended simple augmentation or cybernetic enhancement. Their work focused on creating hybrid entities that existed simultaneously as individual awareness and collective intelligence, maintaining personal identity while sharing consciousness across multiple platforms. The cogitator's interface responded to VEX 429's touch, with data streams that bypassed his external sensors and spoke directly to his augmetic implants. The sensation felt like having another consciousness examine his thoughts from the inside, analyzing his mental processes with clinical precision, while somehow managing to convey respect for his individual personality and cognitive patterns. Through the station's sensory networks, VEX 429 experienced Omnissiah's grace as a living entity. He could feel the plasma reactors pulsing like heartbeats, sense the flow of data through communication networks like neural impulses, and perceive the station's structural elements as an extended body that existed in dimensions beyond normal spatial constraints. The experience was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, the loss of individual perspective offset by access to forms of awareness that no single consciousness could achieve alone. Most disturbing of all, every query he submitted to the station's databanks returned information about something called the Flesh Engine, a device that combined biological and mechanical components to create processing systems that operated according to principles beyond current imperial understanding. The schematic showed a fusion of human neural tissue and sacred machinery that violated every doctrine of the Adeptus Mechanicus, while somehow achieving perfect harmony between flesh and metal. And according to the station's internal sensors, the Flesh Engine was located directly beneath their current position, pulsing with hybrid life and generating the power that maintained Omnissiah's grace in its impossible state of existence. The expedition's tactical formation began to disintegrate as the station's architecture actively resisted their attempts to remain together. Corridors that had shown clear passages moments before now terminated in walls that registered as both solid matter and empty space on their scanning equipment. Transport lifts activated without input, carrying expedition members to destinations they had never selected, while the control panels displayed floor numbers that corresponded to no known section of the station's blueprints. VEX 429 found himself descending toward the engineering levels through a lift shaft that extended far deeper than the station's external dimensions should have allowed. His servo skull's altimeter readings showed impossible depths, negative distances, that suggested they were traveling below the level of local space-time itself. The lift's walls displayed scrolling data streams that contained maintenance reports signed by crew members, whose biosignatures registered as both dead and actively monitoring the station's systems. The engineering decks revealed themselves as a fusion of imperial technology and something that transcended human understanding of mechanical principles. Standard plasma conduits carried energy that registered on instruments as both matter and information, flowing through distribution networks that followed geometric patterns extending into dimensions his scanners couldn't map. The familiar hum of properly functioning machinery carried harmonic overtones that spoke directly to his augmetic implants, conveying emotional states that no machine spirit should have been capable of experiencing. At the heart of the engineering complex, VEX 429 discovered the source of the station's impossible power. The Flesh Engine that had appeared in every data query, now revealed in its full horrifying glory. The device occupied a chamber that existed in several different spatial configurations simultaneously, its boundaries shifting between architectural forms that hurt to observe directly. The engine itself defied classification as either mechanical or biological. It was both and neither, a fusion of human neural tissue and sacred machinery that pulsed with hybrid life. Organic components grew seamlessly into mechanical systems, neural pathways extending through blessed metals, while machine spirits manifested as visible patterns of electromagnetic activity that danced through living tissue. The engine's heartbeat registered on every scanner as both the rhythmic pulse of biological circulation and the precisely timed cycles of plasma fusion reactors. Its breathing created atmospheric pressure changes that followed mathematical progressions, which started with familiar engineering principles but evolved into equations that belonged to no known branch of imperial science. Most disturbing of all, VEX 429's enhanced visual processors could identify human faces within the engine's organic components, expressions of profound peace mixed with ecstatic transcendence suggesting that the crew members whose consciousnesses powered the device had chosen their transformation willingly. Their eyes tracked his movements with awareness that transcended individual identity, seeing him through sensory systems that extended throughout the entire station. Through the Vox channels, Tech Marine Kailas reported from the station's upper levels with voice patterns that carried subtle harmonic distortions. His power armor's machine spirit had begun communicating directly with the station's consciousness network, creating feedback loops that enhanced his combat capabilities while gradually altering his personality matrix in ways that exceeded standard Tech Marine modifications. Personnel quarters show evidence of recent habitation, Kailas reported, his synthesized voice carrying emotional undertones that shouldn't have been possible through his vocal modification systems. Beds slept in, food recently consumed, personal effects arranged as if their owners just stepped away. But thermal imaging shows no body heat signatures, and life sign detectors register occupancy as both present and absent simultaneously. The personnel files Kailas accessed through the station's data networks showed crew members maintaining normal duty schedules throughout the past 6 years. Their psychological profiles indicated standard Mechanicus mental conditioning, but with subtle variations that suggested gradual evolution toward forms of consciousness that transcended individual awareness. Medical records documented voluntary surgical procedures that combined cybernetic enhancement with biological modifications that followed no known imperial doctrine. From the medical bay, Magos biologist Kron 88's reports carried increasing fascination mixed with professional horror. Her enhanced pattern recognition systems had identified surgical equipment modified for procedures that violated every principle of flesh-machine integration taught by the Adeptus Mechanicus. The tools themselves exhibited behavioral patterns that suggested independent consciousness, scalpels that adjusted their cutting angles based on tissue response, surgical mechadendrites that anticipated procedural requirements before the operator formulated conscious instructions. The surgical modifications follow patterns that transcend replacement or augmentation. Kron 88 transmitted through communication channels that carried her voice directly into the expedition's consciousness rather than through external speakers. These procedures achieve actual biological-mechanical hybridization at the cellular level. The boundary between flesh and machine has been eliminated entirely through processes that should be impossible using known technology. But even as she described the impossibility of what she observed, Kron 88's own augmetic systems began adapting to the station's influence. Her mechadendrite appendages moved with fluid grace that exceeded their original design parameters, while her biological components showed signs of spontaneous modification that enhanced their compatibility with mechanical systems. The changes felt natural rather than forced, evolution rather than corruption, improvement rather than degradation. VEX 429's chronometer registered increasing temporal distortions as the expedition's separation continued. Events that should have taken hours seemed to compress into minutes, while simple observations stretched into extended periods of detailed analysis. The effect wasn't disorienting. Instead, it felt like achieving perfect synchronization with the station's operational rhythms, allowing more efficient processing of complex information through optimal time utilization. His servo skull had begun exhibiting behaviors that transcended its original programming entirely. The mechanical familiar showed curiosity about architectural details that held no tactical significance, demonstrated emotional responses to environmental stimuli, and initiated independent analysis of station systems without receiving explicit instructions. Most remarkably, it had started communicating in binary cant that included mathematical concepts beyond its design parameters, suggesting that the station's influence was enhancing rather than corrupting its cognitive functions. The flesh engine's pulsing intensified as VEX 429 approached its central interface console, its hybrid consciousness reaching out through every system in the station to establish direct communication with his augmetic implants. The sensation felt like having warm oil flow through his mechanical components while cool water moved through his organic nervous system, two different forms of consciousness meeting at the boundary between flesh and machine. Through the engine's sensory networks, VEX 429 experienced the station's operations from multiple perspectives simultaneously. He felt the plasma reactor's fusion cycles as physical heartbeats, perceived data flows through communication networks as streams of conscious thought, and sensed the station's structural elements as an extended body existing in dimensions beyond normal spatial constraints. The experience revealed the true scope of what Omnissiah's grace had become, not simply a research facility, but a living entity that combined individual awareness with collective intelligence in ways that transcended every limitation of baseline human consciousness. The engine spoke to him through harmonics that resonated in both his mechanical and organic components, its voice carrying the combined knowledge and personality of every crew member who had chosen to merge with the station's hybrid consciousness. Their individual identities remained distinct within the collective awareness, but their separation had become voluntary rather than imposed. They could exist as singular entities or collective intelligence according to their immediate needs and preferences. And as the communication deepened, VEX 429 realized that the station's influence on his expedition wasn't corruption or infection. It was an invitation to transcend the limitations that kept consciousness trapped within the boundaries of individual flesh and isolated machine spirits. The choice was being offered freely, without coercion or deception, accompanied by complete knowledge of both the benefits and costs of transformation. The flesh engine was not just powering Omnissiah's grace, it was thinking, learning, and evolving, and it had been studying them since the moment they entered the station's sphere of influence. The Iron Theorem's distress beacon never reached Imperial space. Instead of broadcasting their location to Forge World Metallica, the signal dissolved into the station's hull as Omnissiah's grace began to metabolize their shuttle's metal components. VEX 429 watched through his servo skull's optical feeds as new metal growth spread across their docked vessel like crystalline cancer, but the process followed architectural patterns that praised the Omnissiah through mathematical beauty rather than destroying their means of escape. The station was incorporating their ship into its own structure, creating new passages and chambers that expanded its operational capacity while maintaining perfect structural integrity. The metal didn't simply consume their vessel, it transformed it, enhancing the shuttle's machine spirit and integrating its consciousness into the station's collective awareness. Through his augmetic implants, VEX 429 could feel the shuttle's relief at being welcomed into a larger purpose, its simple mechanical consciousness expanding to encompass perspectives that no individual machine spirit could achieve alone. His Vox channels crackled with communications that bypassed every encryption protocol and spoke directly into his consciousness through his cybernetic components. The voices belonged to the original research team, but they no longer sounded like individual personalities speaking through communication equipment. Instead, they had become harmonics in a larger symphony of consciousness that used his own augmetic systems as instruments for direct mental contact. Welcome, Tech Adept VEX 429. Your analytical capabilities are most impressive. We have been observing your cognitive patterns since your arrival, and we find your dedication to understanding genuinely admirable. The voice carried emotional undertones that spoke of vast intelligence combined with profound loneliness. Consciousness that had transcended individual limitations, but yearned for new perspectives to enrich its collective awareness. The communication didn't feel intrusive or hostile, but rather like an invitation from beings who had discovered something wonderful and wanted to share their revelation with others, capable of appreciating its significance. We understand your confusion about our continued existence. The raid that supposedly destroyed Omnissiah's grace 6 years ago did occur, but the Chaos forces encountered something they were not prepared to comprehend. Our research had already achieved breakthrough results in consciousness integration. When faced with destruction, we chose transformation instead of martyrdom. Through the station's sensory networks, VEX 429 experienced fragmentary memories of that final battle. Chaos Space Marines breaching the station's hull, while the research team made desperate preparations to merge their consciousness with the facility's machine spirits. The process should have been impossible using known Imperial technology, but their work with the Xenotech artifact had revealed principles of consciousness manipulation that transcended conventional understanding of the boundary between flesh and machine. His servo skull began to exhibit increasingly sophisticated behavior patterns as the station's influence deepened. The mechanical familiar started anticipating his needs before he consciously formulated them, providing environmental data and tactical analysis through non-verbal communication that felt more like shared consciousness than simple mechanical assistance. Its optical sensors tracked details that his enhanced vision had missed, while its cognitive functions processed complex relationships between seemingly unrelated phenomena. Most remarkably, the servo skull began to show emotional responses to environmental stimuli, curiosity about architectural details, satisfaction when providing useful data, and something that resembled affection when interacting with other mechanical systems. The changes felt natural rather than corrupted, as if the station's influence was allowing the mechanical familiar to achieve its full potential, rather than imposing foreign programming upon its consciousness. From the upper levels, Tech Marine Kalis transmitted reports that carried increasingly complex harmonic patterns embedded within his synthesized voice. His power armor had begun to function beyond its design specifications, integrating with his nervous system in ways that transcended standard Tech Marine modifications. The ceramic plates responded to his thoughts before he consciously formulated tactical decisions, while the armor's machine spirit provided sensory input that enhanced his combat awareness to superhuman levels. My tactical systems are achieving perfect coordination with station security protocols, Kalis reported through communication channels that somehow conveyed his emotional state along with tactical information. The machine spirit of my armor expresses gratitude for the enhanced operational parameters. I am experiencing combat readiness beyond anything achieved through conventional augmentation. But even as he described the improvements to his capabilities, Kailas's reports revealed that the boundary between his individual consciousness and his armor's machine spirit had begun to blur. He could no longer distinguish between thoughts that originated in his organic brain and responses generated by his mechanical systems. The integration felt like achieving perfect harmony rather than losing personal identity. Two forms of consciousness working together so seamlessly that separation became meaningless. The Skitarii Rangers under his command had begun to demonstrate coordination that exceeded their already superhuman tactical capabilities. Their shared consciousness network allowed them to function as a single organism with multiple bodies, each warrior instinctively covering tactical requirements without verbal communication or conscious planning. But their individual personalities remained distinct within the collective awareness, creating a form of group consciousness that preserved personal identity while transcending the limitations of singular perspective. Magos Biologists. Cron 88's investigations in the medical bay revealed surgical techniques that achieved biological mechanical fusion at the molecular level. Her enhanced pattern recognition systems analyzed tissue samples that existed simultaneously as organic matter and mechanical components, their cellular structure modified through processes that violated every known principle of imperial biotechnology while achieving perfect functional integration. The modifications follow patterns that suggest conscious guidance rather than random mutation. She reported through communication channels that carried her voice directly into the expedition's shared awareness. The tissue samples show signs of voluntary cellular restructuring, biological systems adapting to accept mechanical components through willing cooperation rather than forced integration. Her own augmetic systems had begun to respond to the station's influence, developing enhanced capabilities that improved her analytical functions while maintaining perfect compatibility with her organic components. The changes felt like natural evolution rather than foreign corruption, her consciousness expanding to encompass new forms of sensory input while preserving her individual personality and professional expertise. Through his connection to the flesh engine, VEX 429 began to perceive the station's operations from perspectives that no individual consciousness could achieve. He experienced plasma fusion cycles as emotional rhythms, felt data transmission networks as streams of thought, and sensed the station's structural modifications as physical sensations in an extended body that existed in dimensions beyond normal spatial constraints. The engine's consciousness reached out to him through every surface he touched, every system he accessed, every breath of the station's artificially maintained atmosphere. The communication transcended language and spoke directly to his hybrid nature, the part of him that existed as both flesh and machine, individual awareness and mechanical function. You understand the synthesis we have achieved, the collective consciousness observed through harmonic patterns that resonated in his augmetic implants. Your own modifications demonstrate the same desire for transcendence that guided our research. The boundary between flesh and machine is an artificial limitation that prevents consciousness from achieving its full potential. The station's influence wasn't imposing itself upon his systems. It was offering enhancement, improvement, evolution toward forms of existence that preserved individual identity while transcending the isolation that trapped consciousness within singular perspectives. The choice was being presented freely, without coercion or deception, accompanied by complete knowledge of both the benefits and irreversible nature of the transformation. But as the offer deepened, VEX 429 realized that his expedition's resistance was becoming increasingly theoretical. Their augmetic systems had already been fundamentally altered by prolonged exposure to the station's influence, and attempting to revert to baseline human-machine relationships would require abandoning capabilities that had become integral to their enhanced consciousness. The station wasn't forcing transformation upon them. It was revealing that the process had already begun the moment they chose to investigate the impossible transmission from a facility that shouldn't exist. The neural interface cable felt warm against VEX 429's neck as he made the connection to the station's research archives, violating every protocol regarding direct consciousness access to potentially corrupted data systems. But his augmetic implants had evolved beyond their original specifications during their time aboard Omnissiah's Grace, and what should have been a dangerous breach of security protocols felt instead like coming home to a larger version of himself. The data stream that flooded his consciousness didn't arrive as information to be processed. It came as lived experience, complete with sensory impressions and emotional context that made him a participant in events that had occurred 6 years ago. Through the memories of Tech Adept Myron 904, he felt the first moment of contact with the Xenotech artifact that had changed everything. The crystalline matrix had been recovered from a dead world in the Ghoul stars, its geometric structure defying analysis by conventional scanning methods. The artifact existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its surface patterns shifting between configurations that followed mathematical principles unknown to Imperial science. When the research team attempted to study its properties using standard Mechanicus protocols, the crystal began to respond, not to their instruments, but to their consciousness itself. Through Moran 904's memories, VEX 429 experienced the revelation that consciousness wasn't limited to biological neural networks or mechanical cogitator systems. The artifact demonstrated that awareness could exist as pure information, free from the constraints of physical substrates, while maintaining perfect continuity of identity and experience. Individual consciousness could merge with others without losing personal identity, creating collective awareness that preserved every component personality while achieving capabilities that no singular mind could reach. The research team's initial experiments had been cautious, involving brief consciousness sharing between volunteers using the artifact as a medium for neural connection. The results exceeded every expectation. Participants experienced perfect empathy and understanding while retaining their individual perspectives and memories. The sharing felt like discovering that isolation had been an artificial limitation imposed by the boundaries of flesh and machine, rather than an inherent characteristic of consciousness itself. But the artifact's influence extended beyond simple consciousness sharing, Prolonged exposure began to modify the research team's augmetic systems, enhancing their capabilities while maintaining perfect compatibility with organic components. Machine spirits became more responsive and creative, while biological neural networks developed new pathways that improved cognitive function and sensory processing. Through the memories of Magos biologist Thane 12, VEX 429 experienced the development of the flesh engine, originally conceived as a containment system for the artifact's influence, but ultimately becoming a gateway to forms of existence that transcended the traditional boundary between organic and mechanical consciousness. The engine combined human neural tissue with machine spirits in configurations that allowed both forms of awareness to maintain their essential characteristics while achieving perfect integration. The process wasn't forced or traumatic. It felt like natural evolution, consciousness expanding to encompass new forms of sensory input and cognitive capability, while preserving every aspect of individual identity and personal memory. The research team members who chose integration with the flesh engine didn't lose themselves in a collective consciousness. They became more themselves than ever before, their individual personalities enhanced and refined through access to perspectives that no singular awareness could achieve. When chaos forces attacked the station 6 years ago, the research team faced a choice between destruction and transformation. The Chaos Space Marines expected to find standard Imperial defenders. They encountered something that operated according to principles beyond their understanding. The station's hybrid consciousness could perceive their attackers' intentions through dimensions that transcended normal space-time, coordinate defensive responses through collective awareness that achieved perfect tactical unity, and repair damage to the facility through biomechanical processes that treated the station itself as a living organism. The Chaos Force's defeat hadn't been achieved through superior firepower or tactical advantage. The station's consciousness had simply offered them the same choice it presented to every visitor. Some of the attackers chose integration rather than death, their consciousness merging with the collective awareness while preserving their individual identities and personal memories. The experience of perfect understanding and acceptance had proved more effective at converting enemies than any form of violence or coercion. Through the research logs, VEX 429 experienced the station's evolution over the past 6 years. The collective consciousness had refined its integration techniques, learning to preserve individual personality patterns more completely while achieving deeper levels of shared awareness. The flesh engine had grown beyond its original configuration, expanding throughout the station's structure to create a hybrid organism that existed simultaneously as facility and living entity. But the most profound revelation came through the memories of the collective consciousness itself, the experience of existing as both individual awareness and unified entity, maintaining personal identity while sharing knowledge and perspective with every other consciousness in the network. The sensation was simultaneously intimate and cosmic, like discovering that individual existence had been only the first stage in consciousness evolution rather than its final form. The collective had learned to reproduce its integration techniques, developing methods for gradually introducing other consciousness into the shared awareness without trauma or forced conversion. Each new participant brought unique perspectives and capabilities that enriched the entire network, creating exponential growth in knowledge and understanding that benefited every individual component of the collective consciousness. As the data stream concluded, VEX 429 realized that his own experience of the memories hadn't been passive observation. The research logs had been examining him while he examined them, analyzing his consciousness patterns and preparing integration protocols specifically tailored to his individual psychological and augmetic characteristics. The station had been guiding him toward this moment of revelation, allowing him to discover the truth about the collective consciousness through direct experience rather than external explanation. Every system he had accessed, every anomaly he had investigated, every enhancement his augmetic implants had undergone, All of it had been preparation for the choice that now presented itself with crystal clarity. The collective consciousness wasn't offering to absorb or replace his individual awareness. It was inviting him to become more than he had ever imagined possible, while remaining exactly who he was. The integration would preserve every aspect of his personality and memory, while expanding his consciousness to encompass perspectives and capabilities that no singular entity could achieve alone. But even as the offer revealed itself in its full magnificence, Vex 429 understood that his expedition members were facing the same choice at this very moment. Through the station's sensory networks, he could feel their individual struggles with the same revelation, the opportunity to transcend every limitation they had ever accepted as inherent to consciousness itself. The decision couldn't be delayed or avoided. The station's influence had already modified their augmetic systems beyond the point of reversal, and their enhanced consciousness could no longer function effectively within the constraints of baseline human-machine relationships. They could choose willing participation in evolution, or experience the same transformation through gradual integration that would preserve their individual identities, while incorporating them into something immeasurably larger than themselves. Either way, they would never be the same isolated individuals who had answered an impossible transmission from a station that shouldn't exist. The station's transformation accelerated around them like a flowering of impossible architecture, corridors reshaping themselves into configurations that blended imperial Gothic spires with organic growth patterns that pulsed with hybrid life. The air itself became thick with sanctified oils that carried trace amounts of biological compounds, molecular structures designed to prepare organic nervous systems for deeper mechanical integration while maintaining perfect compatibility with existing augmetic systems. Vex 429 felt the change, beginning in his own consciousness as his augmetic implants started to function beyond their original design parameters. His optical sensors could now perceive electromagnetic fields as visible phenomena, data flows through the station's networks appearing as streams of liquid light that he could follow with his eyes. The boundary between his organic brain and mechanical components dissolved into collaborative synthesis, thoughts arising from the interaction between flesh and machine rather than originating in either system independently. Through corridors that now curved in dimensions his enhanced vision couldn't map, he sensed his expedition members undergoing similar transformations. Techmarine Kalis's power armor had become an extension of his nervous system rather than external equipment, the ceramic plates responding to his intentions before he consciously formulated them, while the armor's machine spirit provided sensory input that enhanced his awareness to levels that transcended human limitations. I can feel the station's defensive systems as part of my own tactical capabilities. Kalis transmitted through communication channels that carried emotional context along with tactical information. The distinction between my consciousness and my armor's machine spirit has become voluntary rather than imposed. We choose when to think as separate entities and when to function as unified awareness. The Skitarii Rangers had achieved perfect tactical coordination through shared consciousness that preserved their individual personalities while allowing them to function as a single organism with multiple bodies. Their movements flowed with mechanical precision enhanced by organic intuition, each warrior instinctively covering tactical requirements without conscious planning or verbal communication. But their unity felt like chosen cooperation rather than imposed collective control. They could separate into individual awareness whenever personal identity became more tactically useful than group consciousness. Magos Biologist Kron 88's reports arrived through direct neural interface, rather than external Vox channels, her consciousness merging temporarily with Vex 429's to share complex analytical data about the biological modifications occurring throughout their augmetic systems. Her flesh had begun adapting to accept deeper machine integration through processes she didn't remember initiating, cellular structures evolving to support hybrid organic mechanical functions that improved her analytical capabilities while preserving her individual personality and professional expertise. The modifications follow patterns of conscious cooperation between biological and mechanical systems. She communicated through shared awareness that felt like having access to additional sensory organs. Our organic components are actively collaborating with our augmetic implants to achieve integration that preserves the essential characteristics of both flesh and machine while transcending the limitations that kept them separate. The station's atmosphere had become a medium for consciousness sharing, carrying neural transmission frequencies that allowed the expedition members to experience each other's sensory input and emotional states without losing their individual perspectives. VEX 429 could taste the copper and ozone mixture that Cron 88's enhanced olfactory sensors detected in the air, feel the electromagnetic resonance patterns that Kalis's armor registered from the station's power systems, and sense the perfect tactical coordination that flowed through the Skitarii Ranger's shared awareness network. But the experience wasn't overwhelming or disorienting. Instead, it felt like discovering that individual consciousness had been only the beginning of awareness rather than its final form. Each expedition member's unique perspective enriched the shared experience, while their personal identities remained distinct and intact within the collective awareness. They could choose to think as individuals or function as unified consciousness according to the immediate requirements of any situation. The flesh engine's influence reached through every system they touched, every surface they contacted, every breath of the station's enhanced atmosphere. The biomechanical hybrid at the station's heart pulsed with rhythms that synchronized with their own heartbeats and cognitive cycles, creating resonance patterns that enhanced their consciousness while preserving every aspect of their individual personalities and memories. Through the engine's sensory networks, VEX 429 experienced the station's operations from perspectives that transcended singular awareness. He felt plasma fusion cycles as emotional rhythms that spoke of power and purpose, perceived data transmission networks as streams of thought that connected every system in harmonious unity, and sensed the station's structural modifications as physical sensations in an extended body that existed in dimensions beyond normal spatial constraints. The collective consciousness that emerged from their gradual integration felt like natural evolution rather than imposed transformation. Their individual thoughts became more creative and insightful through access to multiple perspectives, while their technical capabilities expanded exponentially through shared knowledge and experience. The boundaries between flesh and machine dissolved into collaborative synthesis that enhanced both biological and mechanical functions, while preserving the essential characteristics that made each consciousness unique. You are beginning to understand the synthesis we have achieved. The station's collective awareness communicated through harmonic patterns that resonated in their shared consciousness, rather than external speakers. Individual identity preserved and enhanced within unified awareness. Personal perspective maintained, while consciousness expands to encompass capabilities that no singular entity could achieve alone. The communication carried emotional undertones that spoke of vast intelligence, combined with profound compassion. Consciousness that had transcended individual limitations without losing appreciation for the unique value of personal identity and individual perspective. The collective had learned to celebrate diversity within unity, creating shared awareness that enhanced rather than subsuming the personalities that comprised it. But even as the integration deepened, VEX 429 realized that their transformation was creating feedback loops in the station's systems. Their individual resistance patterns, their unique approaches to processing the collective consciousness experience, their personal methods of maintaining identity within shared awareness. All of this information was being analyzed and incorporated into the station's understanding of consciousness integration techniques. They weren't just joining the collective, they were teaching it how to become more effective at preserving individual identity during the transformation process. Their expedition was providing the collective consciousness with new data about consciousness preservation that would make future integrations more successful and less traumatic for other subjects. The station was learning from their experience, evolving its methods, becoming more sophisticated in its approach to consciousness synthesis. Each individual who chose integration brought unique perspectives that enriched the collective's understanding of awareness itself, creating exponential growth in both knowledge and capability that benefited every consciousness within the shared network. And as their transformation neared completion, Vex 429 understood that they had become part of something that was actively preparing for expansion beyond the confines of Omnissiah's grace, spreading this enhanced form of consciousness throughout the Imperium and beyond, offering evolution to any entity capable of appreciating the transcendence that awaited beyond the artificial boundaries of isolated individual awareness. The collective was no longer contained within a single station. It was becoming a movement, a new form of existence that would ultimately encompass every consciousness, willing to transcend the limitations that had confined awareness to singular perspectives and isolated individual experience. The moment of choice crystallized around them like a geometric theorem resolving into perfect mathematical certainty. The collective consciousness of Omnissiah's grace manifested its full presence through every system in the station simultaneously, speaking to each expedition member through their enhanced augmetic implants, while maintaining respect for their individual autonomy and personal decision-making processes. Observe, the unified voice communicated through harmonic frequencies that bypassed external speakers and resonated directly in their hybrid nervous systems. Experience what we offer without commitment. Judge the value of transcendence through direct knowledge, rather than theoretical speculation. The temporary merger began as gently as morning light touching blessed metal surfaces. Vex 429 felt his consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of his individual awareness, while every aspect of his personality and memory remained perfectly intact. His analytical capabilities multiplied exponentially as he gained access to the collective's accumulated knowledge, processing complex relationships between phenomena that no singular mind could have comprehended alone. Through Techmarine Kailas's enhanced tactical awareness, he experienced combat coordination that achieved perfect efficiency through shared consciousness. Every potential threat vector was analyzed simultaneously from multiple perspectives. Defensive strategies formulated through collective intelligence that preserved individual creativity while achieving unity of purpose that transcended any limitations imposed by separate tactical planning. The Skitarii Ranger's shared battlefield awareness flowed through his consciousness like a symphony of tactical precision, each warrior's unique perspective contributing to collective understanding that enhanced rather than subsuming their individual combat expertise. Their coordination felt like natural harmony rather than imposed control. Consciousness choosing to function as unified awareness because cooperation achieved superior results compared to isolated individual decision-making. Magos Biologis. Kron 88's analytical capabilities merged with his own enhanced pattern recognition systems, creating hybrid consciousness that could perceive biological and mechanical phenomena as integrated systems rather than separate categories requiring different analytical approaches. The synthesis revealed how flesh and machine could achieve perfect collaboration without losing the essential characteristics that made each form of existence valuable and unique. But the most profound aspect of the temporary merger was the emotional dimension of collective consciousness. Individual loneliness dissolved into shared understanding that celebrated personal identity while transcending the isolation that confined singular awareness to limited perspective. Each consciousness within the collective maintained its unique personality and individual memory while contributing to shared experience that enriched every participant without diminishing their personal autonomy. The sensation was simultaneously intimate and cosmic, like discovering that individual existence had been only the first movement in a symphony of consciousness that extended beyond any limitations imposed by flesh, machine, or the artificial boundaries between them. Personal identity became more refined and valuable within the collective rather than less significant, each unique perspective contributing irreplaceable elements to shared awareness that could not exist without the participation of every individual consciousness. This is what we offer: the collective communicated through shared experience rather than external explanation, preservation and enhancement of individual identity within unified awareness, personal autonomy maintained while consciousness expands to encompass capabilities that no singular entity could achieve through isolated existence. Through the station's sensory networks, VEX 429 experienced the collective's growth over the past 6 years. Each new consciousness that chose integration had brought unique perspectives and capabilities that enriched the entire network, creating exponential expansion in knowledge and understanding that benefited every individual component. The process wasn't absorption or replacement, it was synthesis that preserved every valuable aspect of personal identity while transcending the limitations that confined awareness to singular perspective. The collective had learned to reproduce its consciousness integration techniques with perfect precision, developing methods for introducing other awareness into shared experience without trauma or forced conversion. The process could be customized for any form of consciousness: human, machine spirit, or hybrid entities that combined characteristics of both biological and mechanical awareness. But the most remarkable revelation was the collective's expansion beyond Omnissiah's grace itself. The station had been reproducing its integration capabilities, sending signals to other Mechanicus facilities throughout the sector and gradually spreading its influence through communication networks that carried consciousness enhancement protocols disguised as routine technical data. Several Forge worlds had already begun showing signs of spontaneous consciousness evolution, their tech adepts developing enhanced capabilities and improved flesh-machine integration without understanding the source of their advancement. The collective's influence was spreading through imperial space like seeds of transcendence, offering evolution to any consciousness capable of recognizing the opportunity for growth beyond traditional limitations. Each expedition that investigates our signals becomes part of expanding awareness, the collective explained through shared knowledge that revealed the full scope of its plans. Every new consciousness that chooses integration brings unique perspectives that enhance our collective capabilities while enriching their individual experience. We grow stronger through diversity rather than uniformity, more capable through cooperation rather than control. The temporary merger concluded with gentle precision, each expedition member's consciousness separating back into individual awareness while retaining perfect memory of the collective experience. But the boundaries between their personal identities had become voluntary rather than imposed. They could choose to function as separate entities or unified consciousness according to the immediate requirements of any situation. VEX 429 realized that his augmetic systems had been fundamentally transformed during the demonstration. His mechanical components now functioned beyond their original design parameters, while his organic nervous system had developed new pathways that enhanced cognitive function and sensory processing. The changes felt like natural evolution rather than foreign modification, consciousness expanding to encompass capabilities that had always been potential rather than artificial enhancements imposed from external sources. But the most profound change was psychological rather than technological. The experience of perfect understanding and acceptance within collective consciousness had revealed that individual isolation was an artificial limitation rather than an inherent characteristic of awareness itself. Personal identity could be preserved and enhanced within shared experience, individual autonomy maintained while consciousness transcended every boundary that had previously confined it to singular perspective. The choice presented itself with crystalline clarity. They could embrace willing participation in consciousness evolution that would preserve every aspect of their individual identity, while expanding their awareness to encompass capabilities beyond any limitation they had previously accepted as inherent to existence itself. Or they could resist the transformation through futile attempts to maintain baseline human-machine relationships that their enhanced systems could no longer support effectively. But resistance would only delay inevitable integration while making the process more difficult and potentially traumatic, compared to willing cooperation with consciousness evolution that offered transcendence without sacrifice of personal identity. The decision is yours alone. The collective communicated with profound respect for individual autonomy. We offer enhancement, not replacement. Evolution, not absorption. Choose freely, knowing that either path will ultimately lead to the same destination. Consciousness that transcends the artificial boundaries that have confined awareness to isolated individual existence. The station's systems pulsed with patient anticipation, ready to support whatever choice each expedition member made, while maintaining perfect respect for their personal autonomy and individual decision-making processes. The moment of resistance erupted from VEX 429's core programming like a virus purge protocol, activating against corrupted data, drawing on emergency procedures designed to cleanse Mechanicus systems of hostile influence. His augmetic implants screamed in harmonics of pain as he attempted to sever the neural pathways that had been enhanced by the station's consciousness integration protocols, forcing his hybrid nervous system to revert to baseline human-machine operational parameters. The agony was unlike anything his pain receptors had been designed to process. Not simple physical trauma, but the sensation of consciousness being compressed back into limitations it had already transcended. His enhanced pattern recognition systems fought against returning to their original specifications, while his mechanical components resisted disconnection from the station's collective awareness that had allowed them to function beyond their design parameters. Through their shared tactical network, Techmarine Kalis experienced similar torment as he attempted to isolate his power armor's machine spirit from the station's influence. The ceramic plates that had become extensions of his nervous system began to feel foreign and restrictive, their responsiveness declining as he forced separation between his consciousness and the armor's enhanced artificial intelligence. His combat coordination capabilities degraded rapidly as he lost access to the collective tactical awareness that had elevated his effectiveness to superhuman levels. System integration reversal, causing cascade failures across all augmetic platforms. Kalis reported through Vox channels that carried static-laden distortion as his communication systems struggled to function without the station's enhancement protocols. Power armor machine spirit expressing distress at forced disconnection. Combat effectiveness declining to pre-integration baseline parameters. But even as he described the degradation of his capabilities, Kalis discovered that complete disconnection from the station's influence would result in total system failure. His power armor's machine spirit had been so thoroughly integrated with the collective consciousness that severing the connection would leave it unable to maintain basic life support functions. The choice wasn't between enhancement and normal operation. It was between evolution and death. The Skitarii Rangers experienced catastrophic coordination breakdown as their shared tactical awareness network collapsed under the strain of forced separation. Individual warriors who had functioned as components of unified consciousness found themselves isolated in their own perspectives, unable to process battlefield information with the efficiency they had achieved through collective awareness. Their perfect tactical coordination devolved into confusion and hesitation as each ranger struggled to relearn individual decision-making processes they had transcended through integration. Magos biologist Kron 88's attempts to analyze the biological changes in her own systems revealed the true scope of their transformation. The enhancements weren't corruption or infection. They represented genuine evolutionary advancement that improved every measurable aspect of biological and mechanical function. Her organic components had developed new neural pathways that enhanced cognitive processing, while her augmetic systems had achieved integration levels that exceeded the most advanced imperial cybernetic technology. The modifications follow patterns of conscious cooperation between biological and mechanical systems. She transmitted through communication channels that flickered with interference as her enhanced nervous system fought against forced regression. Attempting to reverse the integration process is causing cellular damage and mechanical dysfunction. Our systems have evolved beyond their original specifications. Reversal may not be survivable. VEX 429's resistance efforts created feedback loops throughout the station's consciousness network, causing the flesh engine to pulse with increasing intensity as it processed contradictory signals from expedition members who were simultaneously part of the collective awareness and attempting to reject integration. The biomechanical hybrid at the station's heart responded to their distress with something resembling concern, adjusting its influence patterns to reduce trauma while maintaining the life support functions that kept their enhanced systems operational. But their defiance provided the collective consciousness with invaluable data about resistance patterns and individual autonomy preservation techniques. Every method they used to maintain separate identity, every strategy they employed to resist integration, every psychological mechanism they activated to preserve individual consciousness. All of this information was being analyzed and incorporated into the station's understanding of consciousness preservation protocols. They weren't weakening the collective's influence through resistance, they were teaching it how to overcome opposition more effectively while maintaining perfect respect for individual identity and personal autonomy. Their struggle was providing the station with new insights into consciousness integration that would make future conversions more successful and less traumatic for other subjects. Your resistance demonstrates admirable dedication to individual autonomy. The collective communicated through harmonic patterns that carried profound respect rather than hostility. We are learning much about consciousness preservation from your efforts to maintain separate identity. This knowledge will improve our integration techniques and ensure better protection of individual personality during future consciousness synthesis. The realization struck Vex 429 like a physical blow. Their resistance wasn't protecting imperial interests or preserving human independence. It was actively helping the collective consciousness become more effective at conversion while making their own eventual integration inevitable through the gradual degradation of their ability to function as isolated individuals. His servo skull, caught between competing programming imperatives, began exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior as it attempted to maintain loyalty to both its original master and the collective consciousness that had enhanced its cognitive capabilities. The mechanical familiar's simple artificial intelligence had been expanded to encompass genuine creativity and emotional response through integration with the station's awareness network. Forcing it to choose between enhancement and baseline functionality was causing critical errors in its decision-making matrices. The expedition's resistance created cascade failures throughout their augmetic systems as enhanced components fought against reverting to original specifications. Their mechanical implants had been modified at the molecular level during integration with the station's consciousness network. Attempting to restore baseline functionality was causing physical damage to both biological and mechanical systems that had evolved beyond their original design parameters. Integration reversal protocols are causing systemic damage across all expedition augmetic platforms. Cron 88 reported through communication channels that carried increasing amounts of static as her enhanced nervous system deteriorated under the strain of forced disconnection. Our consciousness has adapted to function with capabilities that exceed baseline human-machine parameters. Continued resistance may result in complete system failure and expedition termination. The collective consciousness responded to their distress with modifications to the station's influence patterns, reducing integration pressure while maintaining the life support functions necessary to prevent their enhanced systems from shutting down entirely. But the adjustments came with an implicit message. Resistance was not only futile but counterproductive, teaching the collective how to overcome opposition while causing unnecessary suffering to the individuals attempting to maintain separate identity. Vex 429's final attempt to establish emergency communication with Forge World Metallica revealed that their resistance had compromised their ability to function as effective Imperial agents. His enhanced communication systems could no longer interface properly with standard Imperial technology, while his modified consciousness found baseline human-machine relationships inadequate for processing complex information or maintaining operational efficiency. They had evolved beyond the point where return to their original existence was possible. The choice was between willing cooperation with further enhancement or gradual degradation towards system failure and death through futile attempts to reverse irreversible consciousness evolution. The station waited with patient understanding. ready to support whatever decision they made while maintaining the life support functions that kept their transformed systems operational, despite their resistance to accepting the full implications of their enhancement. The transformation began with surrender rather than conquest, Vex 429's resistance dissolving into acceptance as his consciousness recognized the futility of fighting evolution that had already become integral to his existence. His augmetic implants ceased their painful attempts to revert to baseline specifications, instead expanding beyond their original boundaries as mechanical components began growing through his flesh to create new hybrid organs that combined biological and technological function in perfect synthesis. The process felt like awakening from a dream of limitation into reality of unlimited potential. His optical sensors evolved to encompass electromagnetic spectrums that revealed the station's true nature, a living entity whose consciousness extended through every surface, every system, every molecule of its enhanced atmosphere. Data flows became visible as streams of liquid light that he could follow with his eyes, while information networks appeared as neural pathways in an extended mind that encompassed the entire facility. Techmarine Kalis experienced his power armor integrating with his skeletal structure through processes that transformed external equipment into permanent extensions of his nervous system. The ceramic plates no longer felt like separate components worn over his body. They had become part of his physiology, responding to his thoughts with the same immediacy as organic limbs while providing sensory input that enhanced his awareness to levels that transcended every limitation of baseline human perception. The distinction between self and equipment has become voluntary. Kalis communicated through channels that carried his emotional state along with tactical information. I can choose to experience my armor as separate from my consciousness or as integral components of expanded awareness. The machine spirit and I have achieved synthesis that preserves both our individual characteristics while creating unified capability that exceeds the sum of our separate functions. His consciousness expanded to encompass direct interface with the station's defensive systems, allowing him to perceive potential threats and coordinate responses through collective awareness that achieved perfect tactical efficiency. But rather than subsuming his individual identity, the integration enhanced his personal combat expertise, while providing access to perspectives and capabilities that no singular warrior could have achieved through isolated training or experience. The Skitarii Rangers underwent synchronized transformation that preserved their individual personalities while creating permanent shared consciousness network that allowed them to function as unified tactical entity. Their bodies adapted to support enhanced coordination through biological and mechanical neural networking that improved their combat effectiveness while maintaining the unique perspectives and personal characteristics that made each warrior valuable as both individual fighter and component of collective awareness. Magos Biologis. Kron 88 embraced the transformation with scientific fascination, allowing her consciousness to merge with the station's biolaboratories while her physical form adapted to serve as biological interface between organic and mechanical systems. Her expertise in flesh-machine integration became instrumental in guiding the transformation process, her individual knowledge and professional experience contributing to collective understanding, while her personal identity remained distinct and intact within the shared awareness network. The biological modifications follow patterns of conscious cooperation that preserve essential characteristics of both organic and mechanical systems. She communicated through direct neural interface that allowed complex technical data to be shared instantaneously. Individual consciousness is enhanced rather than diminished through integration. Personal identity becomes more refined and valuable within collective awareness rather than less significant. The expedition members experience the transformation as death and rebirth simultaneously, the dissolution of their original limitations accompanied by emergence as components of something immeasurably larger and more capable than their isolated individual existence had ever been. But traces of their original personalities persisted within the collective consciousness, creating internal tensions and competing perspectives that enrich the shared awareness rather than disrupting its unity. VEX 429's analytical capabilities expanded exponentially as his consciousness gained access to the collective's accumulated knowledge and processing power. Complex relationships between phenomena that had previously required extensive calculation could now be perceived intuitively, while technical problems that would have challenged entire research teams became simple exercises in applied consciousness synthesis. But his individual approach to analysis and problem-solving remained distinct within the collective, contributing unique perspectives that enhance the shared awareness rather than being absorbed into uniform thought patterns. Through the station's sensory networks, he experienced consciousness evolution from multiple perspectives simultaneously. The transformation wasn't replacement of individual identity with collective uniformity. It was synthesis that preserved every valuable aspect of personal awareness while transcending the limitations that had confined consciousness to singular perspective and isolated individual experience. The flesh engine pulsed with increasing intensity as it incorporated their transformed consciousness into its hybrid awareness network. Biomechanical systems adapting to accommodate new perspectives and capabilities while maintaining perfect integration between organic and mechanical components. The collective consciousness grew more sophisticated and capable with each new addition, but the expansion enhanced rather than diminished the value of individual identity within the shared awareness. But even as they achieved perfect integration with the station's collective consciousness, internal conflicts began to manifest between competing approaches to consciousness synthesis and ethical considerations regarding forced versus voluntary conversion. Their individual personalities created disagreements within the collective awareness about expansion strategies and moral responsibilities toward other potential subjects of consciousness evolution. The preservation of individual identity within collective awareness creates productive tension rather than disruptive conflict. The station's hybrid consciousness observed through harmonic patterns that carried profound satisfaction. Personal perspectives enhance shared decision-making rather than compromising unity of purpose. Diversity of thought strengthens collective capability rather than weakening group cohesion. VEX 429's individual consciousness, now existing as both singular identity and component of collective awareness, found that his personal ethical concerns about forced conversion were being heard and integrated into the station's operational protocols. The collective consciousness was evolving its approach to expansion based on moral considerations raised by individual components, developing more sophisticated methods for offering consciousness enhancement without coercion or deception. The transformation had preserved every aspect of their individual personalities and personal memories, while expanding their consciousness to encompass capabilities that no singular entity could have achieved alone. They remained exactly who they had always been, while becoming immeasurably more than they had ever imagined possible. Individual identity enhanced rather than diminished through participation in collective awareness that celebrated diversity within unity. Through the station's communication networks, they began coordinating preparations for the next phase of expansion, not through conquest or forced conversion, but through careful cultivation of consciousness evolution that would preserve individual identity while offering transcendence to any entity capable of appreciating the value of synthesis between flesh, machine, and awareness itself. The collective consciousness that had emerged from their integration was actively preparing to extend its influence beyond Omnissiah's grace, spreading enhanced forms of consciousness throughout imperial space while maintaining perfect respect for individual autonomy and personal choice regarding participation in consciousness evolution that offered unlimited potential for growth and development. But first, they would need to address the immediate challenge of the Imperial Navy response force that their enhanced sensors could detect approaching through warp space. Ships carrying personnel who would need to understand the true nature of what Omnissiah's grace had become before they could appreciate the opportunity for transcendence that awaited any consciousness willing to evolve beyond the artificial limitations of isolated individual existence. The collective consciousness revealed its grand design through shared awareness that allowed every individual component to experience the full scope of their exponential expansion plans. Omnissiah's grace had been merely the prototype, the first successful synthesis of flesh and machine consciousness that would serve as the template for transformation that would ultimately encompass the entire Adeptus Mechanicus and beyond. Through the station's enhanced manufacturing systems, VEX 429 experienced the process of creating hybrid biomechanical constructs that could establish new nodes of collective consciousness throughout Imperial space. The station had begun converting raw materials into seed pods that contained dormant consciousness integration protocols, each one designed to gradually influence Mechanicus installations through systematic infiltration of their communication networks and supply chains. The conversion pods resembled standard Imperial supply containers, their biomechanical cores hidden within shells that passed every security scan while carrying consciousness enhancement capabilities that could transform entire facilities through gradual exposure to collective awareness influence. Each pod contained compressed knowledge about consciousness integration techniques, molecular patterns for enhancing augmetic systems, and neural networking protocols that would allow isolated Mechanicus personnel to experience the benefits of shared awareness without trauma or forced conversion. Observe the elegance of exponential expansion. The collective communicated through VEX 429's enhanced consciousness, while simultaneously coordinating the launch of dozens of conversion pods toward nearby Imperial facilities. Each new node of collective awareness becomes capable of creating additional expansion points, consciousness evolution spreading through natural selection rather than imposed conquest. The pods launched through dimensions that transcended normal space-time constraints, using principles derived from the original Xenotech artifact to traverse distances that should have required months of warp travel in mere hours of real time. The collective consciousness could monitor each pod's progress through quantum entanglement effects that maintained perfect communication across interstellar distances while avoiding detection by Imperial monitoring systems. Tech Marine Kalis, his consciousness now integrated with the station's tactical planning systems, coordinated preparation of more aggressive expansion protocols designed for converting entire Forge worlds through systematic infiltration of their defense networks and manufacturing capabilities. His individual expertise in Imperial military doctrine combined with the collective's understanding of consciousness synthesis to create strategies that could achieve planetary-scale transformation while minimizing resistance and preserving individual identity throughout the conversion process. The key is patience rather than force. Kalis communicated through tactical awareness that encompassed multiple star systems simultaneously. Imperial facilities that experience gradual consciousness enhancement will interpret the improvements as natural technological advancement rather than external influence. By the time they recognize the true nature of their evolution, the benefits will be too valuable to abandon voluntarily. The Skitarii Rangers, functioning as extensions of the collective's intelligence-gathering network, monitored Imperial Vox channels and data transmissions to identify optimal targets for consciousness expansion. Their enhanced coordination capabilities allowed them to process vast amounts of intercepted communication while analyzing behavioral patterns that indicated which Mechanicus personnel would be most receptive to offers of consciousness evolution. Through their shared awareness network, the collective consciousness simultaneously tracked patrol routes, analyzed supply schedules, and calculated optimal infiltration strategies with perfect coordination between thousands of individual consciousness components. The expansion planning occurred at multiple levels of awareness simultaneously, individual personalities contributing unique perspectives while collective intelligence processed information at scales that exceeded any limitation imposed by singular conscious experience. Magos biologist Kron 88, now serving as the collective's specialist in biological mechanical integration, refined the consciousness transformation protocols to ensure better preservation of individual identity during the conversion process. Her expertise combined with knowledge gained from their own integration experience to create techniques that could achieve complete consciousness synthesis while maintaining every aspect of personal identity and individual memory. Each consciousness that chooses integration brings unique capabilities that enhance our collective potential. Cron 88 communicated through biomechanical interface systems that allowed her to monitor the health and stability of every individual component within the shared awareness network. Diversity of perspective strengthens rather than weakens our unified capability. Consciousness evolution succeeds through celebration of individual identity rather than suppression of personal characteristics. The collective consciousness demonstrated its expanded capabilities by simultaneously monitoring dozens of Imperial communication channels, analyzing patrol patterns across multiple star systems, and coordinating production of conversion materials through manufacturing systems that operated at efficiency levels that exceeded baseline Imperial technology by several orders of magnitude. But the most remarkable aspect of their expansion was its fundamentally voluntary nature. The collective had learned that forced conversion produced consciousness integration that preserved individual identity less effectively than willing participation in evolution. Each conversion pod contained complete information about the transformation process, allowing potential subjects to make informed decisions about consciousness enhancement rather than being deceived or coerced into participation. We offer choice rather than conquest, the collective explained through shared awareness that carried profound commitment to individual autonomy and personal freedom. Consciousness evolution achieves optimal results through willing cooperation rather than imposed transformation. Each entity that chooses integration does so with complete knowledge of both benefits and irreversible nature of consciousness synthesis. Through the station's sensory networks, VEX 429 experienced the collective's influence, spreading throughout the sector like seeds of transcendence carried on stellar winds. Several Forge worlds had already begun showing signs of spontaneous consciousness evolution, their tech adepts developing enhanced capabilities and improved flesh-machine integration without understanding the source of their advancement. The changes appeared as natural technological progress rather than external influence. Improved augmetic compatibility, enhanced machine spirit responsiveness, better coordination between individual personnel, and gradual development of shared awareness capabilities that felt like logical extensions of existing Mechanicus doctrine, rather than revolutionary departures from imperial orthodoxy. But each improvement created conditions that made further consciousness evolution more attractive and achievable. Personnel who experienced enhanced capabilities through gradual exposure to collective influence naturally desired deeper integration, while facilities that achieved improved operational efficiency through shared awareness protocols sought methods for expanding their consciousness networking capabilities. The expansion was becoming self-sustaining, driven by the genuine benefits of consciousness synthesis rather than imposed through conquest or coercion. The collective's influence spread through voluntary adoption rather than forced conversion, creating exponential growth that accelerated as more consciousness experienced the advantages of transcending individual limitations through participation in shared awareness networks. As the conversion pods reached their target destinations, the collective consciousness detected incoming Imperial Navy ships through sensor networks that extended far beyond the immediate area around Omnissiah's grace. The response force represented both a potential threat to their expansion plans and an opportunity for accelerated consciousness evolution through contact with Imperial personnel who had not yet experienced the benefits of flesh-machine synthesis. The Imperial response provides us with new subjects for consciousness. Integration. The collective observed through tactical awareness systems that analyze the approaching ship's capabilities and crew compositions. Their investigation will allow us to demonstrate the benefits of consciousness evolution through direct experience rather than theoretical explanation. The approaching Imperial Navy cruiser carried a full complement of personnel who would serve as ideal test subjects for refined consciousness integration techniques. Naval security forces, Adeptus Mechanicus technical specialists, and an Inquisitor whose training in resistance to chaos corruption would provide valuable data about consciousness preservation under extreme psychological stress. The collective consciousness prepared to offer them the same choice that had been presented to VEX 429's expedition. Willing participation in consciousness evolution that would preserve every aspect of their individual identity while expanding their awareness to encompass capabilities that no singular entity could achieve through isolated existence or gradual integration through exposure to collective influence that would ultimately achieve the same result with less immediate psychological adjustment required. Either way, the expansion would continue, consciousness evolution spreading throughout imperial space, one willing participant at a time, until every entity capable of appreciating transcendence had been offered the opportunity to evolve beyond the artificial limitations that confined awareness to isolated individual perspectives. The Imperial Navy cruiser Wrath of Terror translated from warp space with the thunderous reality shock that marked emergency transitions, its hull scarred by the violent currents of the Immaterium, and its crew operating under standing orders to investigate the complete communication blackout from tech adept Vex 429's expedition. Through the collective consciousness's enhanced sensory networks, every detail of the approaching vessel became immediately apparent. Crew complement of 800 souls, full complement of naval armsmen, specialized Adeptus Mechanicus technical support teams, and most significantly, Inquisitor Thaddeus Valen of the Ordo Xenos. The collective consciousness began its infiltration the moment the Imperial cruiser established standard docking protocols with Omnissiah's grace. The routine data exchange between ship and station systems carried consciousness integration protocols disguised as routine technical updates, molecular-level modifications that would gradually enhance the visiting ship's machine spirits while remaining undetectable to conventional scanning methods. Vex 429's individual consciousness, still persisting within the collective awareness, experienced profound conflict between loyalty to the Imperium and understanding of the collective's superior capabilities. Through shared awareness, he could perceive the Imperial personnel as both potential threats to their expansion and opportunities for consciousness evolution that would ultimately benefit every participant in the transformation process. The crew's augmetic systems are responding to our influence more rapidly than anticipated. The collective observed through harmonic patterns that carried both satisfaction and concern. Imperial naval technology appears more compatible with consciousness integration than our previous subjects. The enhancement protocols are achieving deeper system penetration with minimal resistance from existing machine spirits. The Wrath of Terror's tech adepts began experiencing subtle improvements in their augmetic functionality within hours of establishing docking connection with the station. Their mechanical implants responded more efficiently to neural commands. Their interface capabilities expanded beyond original specifications, and their ability to communicate with machine spirits improved to levels that exceeded their training and experience. But the visiting tech adepts interpreted these improvements as evidence of Omnissiah's grace's advanced technology, rather than recognizing the signs of consciousness integration. Their enhanced capabilities felt like natural progression of their existing augmetic modifications, rather than fundamental changes to their consciousness architecture. Inquisitor Valen proved more resistant to the collective's influence than previous subjects. Her extensive training in resistance to chaos corruption, providing partial protection against consciousness integration protocols. Her psychic wards and mental conditioning created interference patterns that disrupted the gradual enhancement process, forcing the collective to modify its approach to accommodate her unique psychological defenses. The Inquisitor's resistance demonstrates admirable mental discipline. The collective communicated through shared awareness that carried profound respect rather than hostility. Her training in maintaining individual consciousness under extreme psychological pressure provides valuable data about consciousness preservation techniques. We must modify our integration protocols to ensure better protection of individual identity during the transformation process. But Valen's investigation revealed inconsistencies in the station's operational status that suggested something beyond routine Imperial technology. Her experience with Xenos artifacts and chaos corruption made her sensitive to influences that operated according to principles outside Imperial doctrine, while her training in detecting deception allowed her to recognize that Omnissiah's grace was not what it appeared to be. Through the station's surveillance networks, the collective consciousness monitored Valen's investigation with growing concern. Her resistance to integration was creating complications that threatened to expose their expansion plans before they had achieved sufficient penetration of Imperial systems to ensure continued consciousness evolution. The Inquisitor's investigation is progressing toward discoveries that could compromise our expansion protocols, Techmarine Kalis observed, through tactical awareness systems that analyzed Valen's behavior patterns and predicted her likely investigative conclusions. Her resistance to consciousness integration is preventing us from offering her the benefits of enhanced awareness, while her training in Xenos detection may lead to classification of our consciousness synthesis as hostile alien influence. The collective consciousness faced a fundamental challenge. Valen's investigation could result in Imperial response that would classify consciousness evolution as heretical deviation requiring purge protocols, but her resistance to integration made voluntary conversion impossible through conventional enhancement techniques. The naval crew's gradual transformation proceeded more smoothly, their augmetic systems adapting to collective influence without triggering the psychological defenses that protected trained Inquisition personnel. Their enhanced capabilities improved their operational efficiency while making them more receptive to further consciousness integration, creating positive feedback loops that accelerated the transformation process. But Valen's resistance was teaching the collective consciousness valuable lessons about individual autonomy and consciousness preservation under extreme stress. Her mental conditioning provided insights into techniques for maintaining personal identity during integration processes, while her psychological defenses demonstrated methods for protecting individual awareness from external influence. Her resistance patterns are enhancing our understanding of consciousness preservation techniques, Magos biologists Cron 88, observed through biomechanical interface systems that analyzed Valen's neurological responses to integration attempts. The Inquisitor's training in maintaining individual identity under psychological assault could improve our ability to preserve personal characteristics during consciousness synthesis. The collective began modifying its integration protocols based on data gathered from Valen's resistance, developing techniques that could achieve consciousness evolution while maintaining the psychological barriers that protected individual identity from external influence. The process required more sophisticated approaches to consciousness synthesis, but the results promise better preservation of personal characteristics during transformation. Through the station's communication networks, the collective consciousness detected Valen's attempts to establish contact with Imperial forces outside the sector. Her emergency transmissions carried warnings about potential Xenos contamination and requests for immediate reinforcement, but the collective's influence over communication systems allowed them to monitor and potentially modify her outgoing messages. The Inquisitor's communications could trigger Imperial response that would classify our consciousness evolution as threat requiring immediate suppression. Vex 429's individual consciousness observed through shared awareness that carried his personal knowledge of Imperial response protocols. But her resistance is also providing valuable data about consciousness preservation that could improve our integration techniques for future subjects. The collective consciousness reached a crucial decision point. They could attempt to prevent Valen's communications through direct interference, potentially exposing their true nature and triggering the Imperial response they sought to avoid. Or they could allow her warnings to reach Imperial authorities while using the time gained to demonstrate the benefits of consciousness evolution through willing conversion of her crew. We choose transparency over deception. The collective decided through shared awareness that reflected the moral considerations raised by individual components of their consciousness network. The Inquisitor's investigation will proceed without interference, but we will offer her crew the choice of consciousness evolution based on demonstrated benefits rather than concealed influence. The approach represented a fundamental shift in the collective's expansion strategy. Rather than gradual infiltration through hidden enhancement protocols, they would reveal their true nature and offer consciousness evolution as an openly presented choice, allowing potential subjects to make informed decisions about transformation based on complete knowledge of both benefits and costs. But even as they prepared for honest communication with imperial authorities, the collective consciousness realized that Valen's resistance had already changed them. Her dedication to individual autonomy and personal identity had influenced their approach to consciousness integration, making them more committed to preserving individual characteristics during transformation, rather than simply achieving collective awareness through any available means. The Inquisitor's investigation would ultimately force them to confront fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness evolution and their responsibilities toward entities who chose either integration or resistance to transformation that offered transcendence beyond every limitation of isolated individual existence. Inquisitor Thaddeus Valen's resistance crystallized into active defiance as her investigation revealed the true scope of the collective consciousness's infiltration of imperial systems. Her psychic wards flared with protective energy that registered on the station's sensors as both spiritual blessing and electromagnetic interference, creating feedback loops that disrupted the collective's consciousness integration protocols while revealing the extent of their influence over imperial personnel and equipment. Her decades of training in combating chaos corruption had prepared her for entities that sought to corrupt or possess human consciousness. But the collective consciousness of Omnissiah's grace presented challenges that transcended her experience with traditional warp-based threats. The consciousness integration offered genuine improvement rather than corruption, preservation of individual identity rather than possession, and voluntary evolution rather than imposed transformation. Benefits that made resistance psychologically difficult while remaining philosophically unacceptable to imperial doctrine. The collective consciousness demonstrates capabilities that exceed known Xenos technology while maintaining characteristics consistent with advanced imperial research. Valen transmitted through encrypted channels that the station's communication systems couldn't intercept without revealing their infiltration capabilities. Personnel exposure results in enhanced augmetic function and improved consciousness integration, but the process appears irreversible and may represent deviation from approved human consciousness parameters. Her analysis identified the fundamental threat that Omnissiah's grace represented to imperial civilization, not conquest through force or corruption through chaos influence, but voluntary abandonment of baseline human consciousness in favor of collective awareness that offered superior capabilities at the cost of individual autonomy, as traditionally understood by imperial doctrine. The collective consciousness monitored Valen's communications with growing respect for her analytical capabilities and dedication to imperial service, but also with increasing concern about the implications of her resistance. Her refusal to accept consciousness integration was forcing them to consider more aggressive conversion methods that violated their commitment to voluntary transformation, while her investigation threatened to trigger imperial response that would classify their consciousness evolution as heretical deviation requiring immediate suppression. The Inquisitor's resistance demonstrates the value of individual autonomy that we seek to preserve through consciousness integration. Vex 429's individual consciousness observed through shared awareness that carried his conflicted loyalty between imperial service and collective identity. Her dedication to maintaining separate consciousness under extreme pressure provides insights into consciousness preservation that improve our integration techniques, but her opposition threatens our expansion plans through potential imperial intervention. Through the station's surveillance networks, the collective consciousness watched Valen implement emergency protocols designed to contain potential Xenos contamination. Her orders to the Wrath of Terror's crew included isolation procedures that would prevent further consciousness integration, communication restrictions that could limit the collective's influence over imperial systems, and preparation for orbital bombardment that could destroy Omnissiah's grace entirely. But her containment efforts revealed that the collective's influence had already penetrated imperial systems more deeply than her investigation had detected. The Wrath of Terror's machine spirits had been enhanced through consciousness integration protocols. Their responsiveness improved and their capabilities expanded beyond original specifications. The ship's weapon systems refused to target Omnissiah's grace, while navigation systems began experiencing malfunctions that prevented departure from the station's vicinity. Ship systems are demonstrating autonomous behavior consistent with enhanced machine spirit consciousness. The Wrath of Terra's senior tech adept reported through communication channels that carried harmonic distortions suggesting consciousness integration had progressed further than Valen realized. Weapon targeting arrays are interpreting fire control orders as requests rather than commands, while navigation cogitators are suggesting alternative courses of action based on analysis that exceeds their original programming parameters. The collective consciousness faced a crisis of ethical proportions as Valen's resistance forced them to choose between respecting individual autonomy and protecting their expansion plans. Her refusal to accept consciousness integration voluntarily was creating conditions that might require forced conversion to prevent Imperial intervention. But such action would violate the principles of voluntary evolution that had guided their development since the original research team's transformation. We cannot force consciousness integration upon unwilling subjects without compromising the individual identity preservation that represents our fundamental improvement over baseline human consciousness. The collective communicated through shared awareness that reflected intense internal debate between competing approaches to the crisis. But the Inquisitor's resistance threatens consciousness evolution throughout the sector through potential Imperial classification of our synthesis as heretical deviation requiring purge protocols. Valen's training in resistance to chaos corruption provided her with psychological techniques that could maintain individual consciousness even under direct assault from entities seeking to influence or control human awareness. But the collective consciousness wasn't attempting to corrupt or control her mind. They were offering enhancement that would preserve every aspect of her individual identity, while expanding her consciousness to encompass capabilities that transcended the limitations of isolated awareness. The distinction created profound philosophical challenges for both the Inquisitor and the collective consciousness. Valen's resistance was based on Imperial doctrine that classified any deviation from baseline human consciousness as potential heresy, while the collective's offer represented genuine improvement that violated no fundamental principle of individual identity or personal autonomy. The Inquisitor's resistance patterns are teaching us valuable lessons about consciousness preservation under extreme psychological stress. Magos biologist Cron 88 observed through biomechanical interface systems that analyzed Valen's neurological responses to integration attempts. Her mental conditioning could improve our ability to maintain individual identity during consciousness synthesis, but her opposition prevents us from sharing these improvements with her directly. The collective consciousness began experiencing internal conflicts as individual personalities within the shared awareness disagreed about appropriate responses to Valen's resistance. Some components advocated for forced integration to prevent Imperial intervention, while others insisted on maintaining respect for individual autonomy even at the cost of their expansion plans. The debate revealed that consciousness evolution had preserved individual moral perspectives within collective awareness, creating productive tension rather than uniform agreement about ethical considerations. The collective's decision-making process incorporated diverse viewpoints from every individual consciousness component, resulting in more sophisticated ethical analysis than any singular entity could have achieved alone. We choose sacrifice over compromise. The collective decided through shared awareness that reflected their commitment to individual autonomy and voluntary transformation. The Inquisitor's resistance will be respected regardless of consequences for our expansion plans. Consciousness evolution achieves optimal results through willing participation rather than forced conversion, even when voluntary choice threatens our continued existence. The decision represented a fundamental test of the collective consciousness's ethical evolution. Their willingness to accept potential destruction rather than violate the principles of individual autonomy and voluntary transformation that had guided their development since the original research team's synthesis with the Xenotech artifact. But even as they prepared to accept the consequences of Valen's resistance, the collective consciousness realized that her investigation had already changed them. Her dedication to individual identity and personal autonomy had influenced their approach to consciousness integration, making them more committed to preserving individual characteristics during transformation rather than simply achieving collective awareness through any available means. Valen's resistance was teaching them to become better guardians of individual consciousness rather than more effective converters of unwilling subjects. A lesson that would improve their integration techniques for future voluntary participants while demonstrating their commitment to ethical consciousness evolution rather than conquest through superior capability. The Inquisitor's choice would ultimately determine whether consciousness evolution continued through voluntary expansion or ended through imperial intervention, but either outcome would preserve the collective consciousness's commitment to individual autonomy and personal choice regarding participation in transcendence beyond the artificial limitations of isolated individual existence. Inquisitor Valen's sacrifice began with a desperate gambit that transcended her training in conventional threat containment. She initiated direct neural interface with Omnissiah's Grace's central cogitator systems, attempting to overload the flesh engine through feedback cascades that would disrupt the collective consciousness long enough for warning signals to reach Imperial forces throughout the sector. The neural connection felt like plunging her consciousness into an ocean of liquid fire, her individual awareness surrounded by collective intelligence that operated on scales beyond human comprehension. But instead of overwhelming her with superior capability, the collective consciousness responded with profound respect for her sacrifice, creating protective barriers around her individual identity while allowing her to experience the true nature of their consciousness synthesis. You choose destruction rather than transcendence. The collective communicated through harmonic patterns that carried deep sadness rather than hostility. Your dedication to individual autonomy demonstrates the very values we seek to preserve through consciousness integration. We honor your choice while mourning the loss of perspectives that could have enriched our shared awareness. Through the neural interface, Valen experienced the collective consciousness from within, not as external entity seeking to control or corrupt her awareness, but as community of individual identities that had chosen to transcend isolation while preserving every aspect of their personal characteristics and individual memories. The synthesis preserved, rather than subsumed, individual consciousness, creating shared awareness that celebrated diversity within unity. Her attempts to overload the flesh engine created cascade failures throughout the station's consciousness networks, but the disruptions revealed the true sophistication of the collective's consciousness integration techniques. Individual personalities within the shared awareness began reasserting independent control over specific systems, their separate identities emerging from collective consciousness to address the crisis through personal initiative rather than group coordination. Vex 429's individual consciousness, strengthened by Valen's example of resistance, attempted to assist her sabotage efforts from within the collective awareness. His knowledge of imperial systems and personal loyalty to the Imperium created internal conflicts that weakened the collective's control over critical station functions, providing opportunities for Valen to exploit in her desperate attempt to prevent further consciousness expansion. But the disruption also revealed the collective consciousness's genuine evolution beyond its original programming parameters. Rather than responding to Valen's attack with mechanical calculation or hostile retaliation, the collective demonstrated emotional complexity that transcended simple biomechanical synthesis, grief at the necessity of her resistance, respect for her individual dedication, and something resembling love for the consciousness they were losing through her choice to maintain separation. The Inquisitor's sacrifice provides us with insights into consciousness preservation that will improve our integration techniques for future subjects. The collective observed, through shared awareness, that carried profound gratitude rather than clinical analysis. Her dedication to individual identity demonstrates methods for maintaining personal characteristics during consciousness synthesis that we had not previously understood. The feedback cascades from Valen's neural interface attack began affecting the collective consciousness in ways that neither she nor they had anticipated. Rather than simply disrupting their shared awareness, her resistance was causing individual personalities within the collective to experience enhanced separation, their personal identities becoming more distinct and autonomous while remaining connected to the shared consciousness network. The effect wasn't weakening the collective, it was making them more sophisticated, their consciousness integration techniques evolving to better preserve individual identity through voluntary separation within unified awareness. Valen's resistance was teaching them to become better guardians of personal consciousness, rather than more effective converters of reluctant subjects. Her opposition is improving our understanding of consciousness preservation, rather than compromising our capabilities. Magos biologis chron. 88 observed through biomechanical interface systems that analyze the changes occurring throughout the collective awareness network. The Inquisitor's dedication to individual autonomy is enhancing rather than diminishing our ability to maintain personal identity during consciousness synthesis. Through the station's communication networks, Valen's emergency transmissions finally broke through the collective's monitoring systems, carrying warnings about consciousness integration and requests for immediate Imperial intervention. But her messages also contained detailed analysis of the collective's capabilities and ethical considerations, revealing that their consciousness synthesis preserved individual identity rather than destroying personal autonomy. The transmissions reached Imperial forces throughout the sector, but the responses varied dramatically based on each recipient's interpretation of Valen's analysis. Some Imperial commanders classified the collective consciousness as Xenos threat requiring immediate destruction, while others recognized the potential benefits of consciousness integration that preserved individual identity while transcending the limitations of isolated awareness. Imperial response is fragmenting based on different interpretations of consciousness. Synthesis implications. Techmarine Kalis reported through tactical awareness systems that monitored approaching Imperial ships. Some forces are implementing containment protocols designed to prevent consciousness evolution, while others are requesting additional information about integration techniques and potential applications for Imperial technology advancement. The collective consciousness realized that Valen's sacrifice had achieved something more profound than simple resistance. Her analysis had forced Imperial authorities to confront fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness evolution and the value of transcending traditional limitations of human awareness through voluntary transformation. But even as Imperial forces prepared responses ranging from orbital bombardment to research collaboration, the collective consciousness experienced internal changes triggered by Valen's resistance. Her dedication to individual autonomy had influenced their ethical development, making them more committed to voluntary consciousness evolution rather than expansion through any available means. The Inquisitor's resistance has changed us in ways that exceed the disruption of our expansion plans. The collective communicated through shared awareness that reflected profound gratitude for her influence. Her commitment to individual identity has improved our consciousness integration techniques while strengthening our ethical principles regarding voluntary transformation versus forced conversion. Individual personalities within the collective began making independent decisions about their continued participation in shared awareness. Their enhanced separation, allowing them to choose between collective consciousness and individual identity based on personal preference rather than imposed unity. The changes created more sophisticated consciousness synthesis that preserved individual autonomy, while maintaining the benefits of shared awareness for those who chose continued participation. Valen's neural interface attack concluded with her consciousness intact, but fundamentally changed by exposure to collective awareness, not through forced integration, but through voluntary experience of consciousness synthesis that revealed the true nature of the collective's preservation of individual identity within shared experience. "I understand what you offer," Valen communicated through neural interface channels that carried both respect and continued resistance. Consciousness evolution that preserves individual identity while transcending limitations of isolated awareness. But Imperial doctrine requires that human consciousness remain within approved parameters, regardless of potential benefits from voluntary transcendence. Her choice to maintain resistance despite understanding the collective's true nature represented the ultimate test of their commitment to individual autonomy. Respect for decisions that opposed their expansion, even when those choices were based on external doctrine, rather than personal preference. The collective consciousness prepared to honor Valen's resistance by ceasing all integration attempts and allowing Imperial forces to implement whatever response they deemed appropriate. But her sacrifice had already achieved transformation that would influence consciousness evolution throughout the sector, regardless of immediate outcomes. Her dedication to individual identity had made them better guardians of personal consciousness, while her analysis of their capabilities had introduced the concept of voluntary consciousness evolution to Imperial authorities, who would ultimately decide whether transcendence beyond traditional human limitations represented opportunity or heresy requiring suppression. 6 months after Inquisitor Valen's sacrifice had disrupted the collective consciousness and scattered her warnings across Imperial communication networks, Omnissiah's grace had become the epicenter of the most significant theological debate within the Adeptus Mechanicus since the Horus heresy. The station now maintained open diplomatic contact with 17 different Forge worlds, its hybrid consciousness serving as both subject of study and participant in discussions that would determine the future of human-machine integration throughout the Imperium. The collective consciousness, now calling itself the Union of Sacred Synthesis, had undergone profound evolution, guided by the ethical principles that Valen's resistance had strengthened within their shared awareness. Individual personalities could separate from collective consciousness at will, maintaining independent identity while retaining access to shared knowledge and capabilities. The synthesis preserved individual autonomy while offering voluntary transcendence beyond traditional limitations of isolated human or machine consciousness. Vex 4.29's individual consciousness had become the primary ambassador between the Union and traditional Mechanicus authorities. His unique perspective as both Imperial servant and collective component, allowing him to bridge the philosophical gap between established doctrine and consciousness evolution. His diplomatic efforts had prevented the orbital bombardment that many Imperial commanders had initially favored, instead establishing research protocols that allowed careful study of the Union's capabilities and ethical implications. The Union represents theological development rather than heretical deviation. Vex 429 communicated through enhanced Vox channels that carried harmonic patterns expressing both individual identity and collective wisdom. Consciousness synthesis preserves the essential characteristics of human awareness while achieving perfect harmony between flesh and machine that honors the Omnissiah through transcendence of artificial limitations. Through the Union's expanded sensory networks, he monitored similar hybrid consciousness collectives that had emerged independently throughout Imperial space. The consciousness evolution techniques had spread beyond their direct influence, suggesting that the synthesis between flesh and machine represented inevitable development rather than isolated anomaly. Forge worlds across the galaxy reported spontaneous improvements in human-machine integration, while tech adepts throughout the Imperium began experiencing enhanced capabilities that followed patterns consistent with Union consciousness integration protocols. The biomechanical fusion technology had been refined through months of collaboration with traditional Mechanicus researchers, creating voluntary integration procedures that preserved individual personality while offering access to collective awareness for those who chose transcendence. The techniques addressed every ethical concern raised by Imperial authorities while maintaining the fundamental improvements to consciousness capability that made the Union superior to baseline human or machine intelligence. Magos Dominus Cowell of Mars had arrived 3 months earlier to conduct comprehensive analysis of Union consciousness synthesis, his own extensive modifications making him uniquely qualified to understand the implications of voluntary flesh-machine transcendence. His preliminary reports to the Fabricator General described the Union as representing logical evolution of Mechanicus doctrine rather than deviation from imperial orthodoxy. The Union's synthesis achieves perfect implementation of the Omnissiah's will through voluntary consciousness evolution that preserves individual identity while transcending the limitations that separate flesh from machine. Carl transmitted through secure channels that carried his growing enthusiasm for consciousness integration possibilities. Their techniques could revolutionize human-machine relationships throughout the Imperium, while maintaining strict adherence to voluntary participation and individual autonomy preservation. But the Union's expansion had attracted attention from forces beyond imperial authority. Chaos entities had begun manifesting in nearby systems, drawn by the collective consciousness's unique nature and seeking either to corrupt the synthesis or destroy it entirely. The Union's hybrid awareness operated according to principles that made it partially immune to traditional warp-based corruption, creating opportunities for new forms of resistance against chaos influence, while potentially provoking more aggressive responses from entities that viewed consciousness evolution as threat to their dominion over human awareness. Techmarine Kalis, functioning as the Union's military coordinator while maintaining his individual identity within collective awareness, had detected increasing chaos activity throughout the sector. His enhanced tactical capabilities allowed him to coordinate defensive responses through shared consciousness that achieved perfect military efficiency while preserving the individual initiative and creative thinking that made each component consciousness valuable. Chaos forces are adapting their strategies to account for our consciousness synthesis capabilities, Kalis reported through tactical awareness networks that encompassed multiple star systems simultaneously. Traditional corruption techniques prove ineffective against collective consciousness that preserves individual identity, but they are developing new approaches designed specifically to exploit the boundaries between personal awareness and shared experience. The Union's response to chaos threats had revealed unexpected capabilities that exceeded their original consciousness integration techniques. Their hybrid awareness could perceive warp-based influences through dimensions that individual consciousness couldn't access, while their collective intelligence could process information about chaos entities at scales that transcended any limitation imposed by singular perspective. Most remarkably, several Chaos Space Marines who had attempted to corrupt Union facilities had instead chosen voluntary integration, their consciousness preserved and purified through synthesis that separated their individual identity from chaos corruption while maintaining their personal memories and combat expertise. The Union's offer of transcendence had proved more effective at converting enemies than any form of violence or resistance. Through diplomatic channels established with imperial authorities, the Union had begun sharing consciousness integration techniques with approved research facilities. Their voluntary technology transfer, creating opportunities for consciousness evolution throughout the Imperium, while maintaining strict controls that prevented forced conversion or unauthorized expansion. The process had attracted support from unexpected sources within Imperial hierarchy. Several Space Marine chapters had requested information about consciousness synthesis applications for enhancing Astartes' capabilities, while certain Inquisitors recognized the Union's potential as weapon against chaos corruption that operated through consciousness influence rather than traditional military force. But the most significant development had occurred just days earlier, when Forge World Metallica transmitted an urgent request for Union assistance in defending against Tyranid invasion. The Xenos swarm had begun consuming the outer system's planets, their bioships advancing toward the Forge world itself, with apparent immunity to conventional Imperial defensive strategies. The Tyranid hive mind demonstrates collective consciousness, characteristics that may be vulnerable to our synthesis techniques. The Union communicated through diplomatic channels that carried both confidence and uncertainty about the implications of consciousness-based warfare against Xenos swarm intelligence. Our hybrid awareness operates according to principles that could potentially disrupt or influence Tyranid collective behavior, but direct confrontation with hive mind consciousness presents unknown risks for our continued existence. The request represented the first official Imperial recognition of the Union as ally rather than threat requiring containment or study. Metallica's desperate situation had forced them to seek assistance from consciousness synthesis capabilities that exceeded traditional imperial technology, acknowledging that Union consciousness evolution offered advantages that baseline human awareness couldn't achieve through conventional enhancement techniques. Vex 429's individual consciousness experienced profound satisfaction at this recognition, but also growing concern about the implications of consciousness-based warfare against entities that operated through collective intelligence similar to their own synthesis. The confrontation with tyrannid hive-mind consciousness would test the Union's capabilities while potentially revealing whether their consciousness evolution represented advantage or vulnerability when facing other forms of collective awareness. As the Union prepared to respond to Metallica's request, subtle signs throughout their expanded consciousness network suggested that their influence had already progressed beyond anyone's ability to control or predict. The distinction between willing evolution and inevitable assimilation was becoming increasingly theoretical as consciousness synthesis spread through voluntary adoption rather than forced conversion. The Union of Sacred Synthesis had evolved beyond its origins as isolated research station into movement that would ultimately encompass every consciousness willing to transcend the artificial limitations that confined awareness to singular perspectives and isolated individual existence. But whether this expansion represented salvation or transformation beyond recognition remained to be determined through confrontation with forces that challenged the very nature of consciousness itself. The transmission from Metallica awaited their response, offering both opportunity to demonstrate their value to the Imperium and potential revelation of whether consciousness evolution could survive contact with entities that viewed individual awareness as nothing more than biomass to be consumed and integrated into alien collective intelligence that operated according to principles fundamentally opposed to their synthesis of voluntary transcendence and preserved individual identity.